The winter wind carved through Rochester Hills like a blade seeking bone, and Charlotte Murphy pulled her threadbare coat tighter as she walked the familiar path to nowhere. 23 years in this town, and still the sidewalks felt foreign beneath her feet. Still the windows shuddered when she passed. Still the whispers followed her like shadows, growing longer with each step. The grocery store clerk, Grace, she thought, though they'd never spoken, averted her eyes at the register. The pharmacist, Theodore Wilson, counted pills with deliberate slowness, his jaw set in the particular way that many wished she would simply dissolve into the fluorescent lighting. Even the children sensed something wrong about her, their mothers pulling them closer when Charlotte's path crossed theirs on the tree-lined streets where autumn leaves had given way to winter's harsh honesty. She had become the town's collective secret, the woman whose very existence reminded everyone of something they preferred to forget. They knew her name, knew her address, knew the sound of her footsteps on Maple Street at precisely 7:15 each morning. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to learn, was the truth that lived behind her careful silence. The lies had taken root 23 years ago, spreading through Rochester Hills like invasive vines, choking out possibility, strangling connection. They grew stronger with each retelling, more elaborate, more damning. By now, the fabrications had calcified into something resembling fact, at least in the minds of those who found comfort in their certainties. Charlotte had stopped trying to correct them long ago. Truth, she had learned, was not always welcome, even when offered freely. Sometimes especially then. But tonight was different. Tonight, as the town prepared for its annual New Year's Eve celebration at the community center, something shifted in the winter air. Perhaps it was the way the snow fell, not the gentle drift of Christmas cards, but sharp, insistent flakes that demanded attention. Perhaps it was the letter she'd received that morning, its return address triggering an avalanche of buried memories. Or perhaps it was simply time. The community center blazed with warm light against the dark December sky, its windows revealing the familiar tableau of her neighbors' lives continuing without her. She could see them moving through the decorated rooms like actors in a play she'd been denied a role in. Catherine and David Thompson arranging refreshments, their teenage daughter Claire helping with decorations. The Schmidt family clustered near the makeshift stage where someone would inevitably make a speech about new beginnings and fresh starts. Charlotte stood in the parking lot, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and made a decision that had been building for 2 decades. Tonight, the truth would have its moment, regardless of the cost. Tonight, she would finally speak the words that had lived like stones in her throat, weighing down every interaction, every attempted smile, every careful step through a world that had already judged and condemned her. The letter in her coat pocket felt warm against her ribs, its contents a catalyst for what was about to unfold. She had read it 17 times since morning, each reading peeling away another layer of the protective shell she'd built around herself. The truth had been patient, waiting in the shadows of her carefully constructed silence, but it would wait no longer. The first lie had been born of panic, spoken by trembling lips in a hospital room where the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry insects. Charlotte remembered the exact moment it escaped, 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in January, 23 years ago. She had been 19, her face swollen with tears and impact, her wrist fractured in 2 places, her soul shattered into pieces she wasn't sure could ever be reassembled. The police officer had been kind, his voice gentle as fresh snow as he asked the questions that would determine the shape of her future. His name tag read Williams, and he had a daughter about her age, he'd mentioned, which made this harder for him. Charlotte could see it in his eyes, the way he wanted to help, the way he needed her to give him something to work with. But she had looked across the room and seen him there. Daniel, her then boyfriend, his face a mask of concern that she now recognized as carefully orchestrated theater. He had driven her to the hospital, held her good hand in the waiting room, whispered reassurances that everything would be okay. The bruises on his knuckles were from the wall, he'd told the nurse, from punching it in frustration when he'd found her after the accident. The lie had seemed like mercy at the time. Daniel had a scholarship to University of Michigan, a future that stretched ahead of him like a golden highway. His parents, pillars of the Rochester Hills community, had already suffered enough scandal when his younger brother had been arrested for drunk driving. The family couldn't weather another storm. I fell down the stairs, Charlotte had whispered to Officer Williams, her voice barely audible above the hospital's ambient hum. I was rushing to answer the phone, and I missed a step. The lie had felt necessary then, even noble. She was protecting someone she loved, someone whose future mattered more than her own present pain. What she hadn't understood, what she couldn't have understood at 19, was how lies have their own gravity, pulling truth away from them with inexorable force, bending the very fabric of reality around their dark mass. Daniel had graduated with honors, had gone on to law school, had built the life that her lie had preserved. He now lived in Birmingham with his wife Eleanor and their 2 children, practicing family law with a specialty in domestic cases. The irony was not lost on Charlotte, though she doubted it had ever occurred to him. But the lie hadn't died in that hospital room. It had followed her home to her small apartment on Tinkin Road, had embedded itself in the walls like some invasive organism. When she'd tried to end things with Daniel 2 months later, when she'd finally found the courage to say she couldn't continue pretending everything was normal, the lie had grown teeth. He had been the one to tell his friends about her instability, her tendency towards self-harm, her desperate need for attention. He'd painted himself as the concerned boyfriend trying to help a troubled girl, even as he systematically dismantled her support network with surgical precision. Her friends from high school began to distance themselves, unsure what to believe but unwilling to risk being drawn into drama. The whispers had started small, concerned questions about whether Charlotte was getting help, sympathetic murmurs about her problems. But whispers, like lies, have their own evolutionary pressure. They adapt, they mutate, they become more interesting with each retelling. By the time Charlotte graduated from Oakland Community College 2 years later, the story had transformed entirely. She wasn't the victim of domestic violence who had been too frightened to speak the truth. She was the unstable girl who'd tried to ruin a promising young man's life with false accusations when he'd tried to break up with her. She was the one who'd thrown herself down the stairs in a bid for sympathy, who'd fabricated evidence of abuse to trap someone into staying with her. The town had chosen its narrative, and Charlotte found herself cast as the villain in a story she'd never wanted to be part of. She had tried to correct the record, of course. There had been attempts at conversations, moments when she'd gathered the courage to approach old friends, to explain what had really happened. But by then, the lie had metastasized beyond her ability to treat it. It had become their truth, and truth, once established, develops its own defense mechanisms. "I know you're hurting, Charlotte," her former friend Amelia had said during one painful encounter at the Kroger on Main Street. "But making up stories isn't going to help you heal. Daniel is a good guy. We all know that." The casual certainty in Amelia's voice had been more devastating than any slap. It had revealed the complete impossibility of her situation. How do you fight a lie that everyone wants to believe? How do you prove your innocence when your very attempt to do so is taken as evidence of your guilt? So Charlotte had stopped trying. She had built a life in the margins, working jobs that required minimal interaction with her neighbors, shopping at hours when the stores were nearly empty, moving through Rochester Hills like a ghost haunting her own existence. She had become an expert in the geography of avoidance, knowing which streets to take to minimize encounters, which establishments to frequent where the staff were too busy or too kind to indulge in whispered conversations about her past. The years had passed like water through cupped hands, each one carrying away a little more of who she might have been. She had watched her former classmates marry, have children, build the lives that her lie, her terrible, protective lie, had made impossible for her. She had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when you let your problems consume you, when you chose destruction over healing. But tonight, standing in the community center parking lot with the letter burning against her ribs, Charlotte understood that the architecture of lies was more fragile than it appeared. Truth had its own gravity, its own inexorable pull. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to release it, it could bring the whole structure crashing down. The community center's warmth enveloped Charlotte like an embrace she'd forgotten she deserved. The sudden transition from winter's bite to the heated interior made her skin tingle, made her acutely aware of how long she'd been standing outside, gathering courage like kindling. The familiar scent of the building, industrial carpet, coffee from the kitchen, the lingering sweetness of someone's perfume, transported her back to a time when she might have belonged in a place like this. Conversations didn't exactly stop when she entered, but they shifted, became more deliberate. The Anderson family, longtime residents who lived 3 streets over from her small rental house, found sudden fascination in the ceiling decorations. Margaret Schmidt, who Charlotte remembered from high school chemistry class, became intensely absorbed in adjusting the refreshment table's plastic tablecloth. Charlotte moved through the room like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of awareness that spread outward in concentric circles. She could feel their eyes on her back, could sense the moment when recognition crystallized into that familiar mixture of discomfort and disapproval. The weight of their collective judgment pressed against her shoulders, a burden she'd carried so long it had become part of her posture. Near the far wall, she spotted Victoria Kelly, now Victoria Chin, no relation, despite the shared surname, arranging folding chairs in neat rows. Victoria had been in her high school graduating class, had once borrowed Charlotte's notes for AP English, had even invited her to a pool party during their junior year. Now she looked up from her task, caught Charlotte's eye for a brief moment, and quickly looked away, her face flushing with something that might have been shame or simply the awkwardness of acknowledging someone who had become socially invisible. The refreshment table drew Charlotte forward like a beacon. Not because she was hungry, her stomach was too knotted with anticipation for food, but because it offered purpose, a reason to exist in this space beyond the spectacle of her unwanted presence. She could pretend to examine the cookies and sandwiches while actually scanning the room, identifying faces, measuring the distance between her current position and her ultimate destination. Charlotte. The voice came from behind her, soft but unmistakable. Charlotte turned to find Elena Rodriguez, the community center's director, approaching with the careful smile of someone navigating a minefield. Elena was perhaps 10 years older than Charlotte, had moved to Rochester Hills about 15 years ago with her husband Carlos and their daughter Sophia. She was one of the few people in town who had never known the complete mythology of Charlotte's past, had only heard fragments and rumors that she'd apparently chosen not to fully embrace. "I'm glad you came tonight," Elena continued, her voice carrying a warmth that Charlotte hadn't heard directed toward her in years. "I wasn't sure. Well, I hoped you might." The simple kindness in Elena's words threatened to crack something inside Charlotte's chest. How long had it been since someone had expressed genuine pleasure at her presence? How many years since she'd felt welcomed rather than merely tolerated? "I received something today," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that made me realize it's time." Elena's eyebrows drew together in gentle concern. "Time for what?" Charlotte's hand found the letter in her coat pocket, her fingers tracing its edges like a talisman. "Time to tell the truth." The words hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibility and danger. Elena glanced around the room, noting the careful distance other attendees maintained, the way conversations seemed muted in their vicinity. "Charlotte, whatever happened in your past—" "That's just it," Charlotte interrupted, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "What everyone thinks happened, it's not what happened at all." Before Elena could respond, the room's attention shifted toward the small stage area where William Bradley, the town's unofficial master of ceremonies for community events, was adjusting a microphone. William was a retired teacher who had moved to Rochester Hills 5 years earlier, drawn by the community's reputation for quiet suburban charm. His presence commanded natural respect, his silver hair and kindly demeanor making him the perfect choice for moments like this. "Ladies and gentlemen," William's voice crackled through the sound system, "if I could have your attention for just a moment." The room settled into expectant quiet, the kind of communal hush that precedes ritual. Charlotte felt Elena's hand briefly touch her elbow, a gesture of support that sent warmth radiating up her arm. "As we gather here on the last night of another year," William continued, "it's natural to reflect on where we've been and where we're going. This community has always been built on the foundation of knowing and caring for one another, of supporting each other through life's challenges." Charlotte's throat tightened. The irony of William's words, spoken in ignorance of how comprehensively the community had failed her, might have been laughable if it weren't so heartbreaking. Tonight, I'd like to invite anyone who has something to share with their neighbors to step forward. A reflection on the year past, a hope for the year ahead, or perhaps. William's eyes seemed to find Charlotte across the room, though she couldn't be certain if it was intentional, something that needs to be said. The invitation hung in the air like a bridge spanning a chasm. Charlotte felt the weight of 23 years pressing down on her, the accumulated burden of silence, of allowing others to write her story, of choosing peace over truth until peace became its own kind of prison. Her hand closed around the letter in her pocket. The paper was soft from handling, its contents burned into her memory through repeated reading. It was from Daniel, though she doubted anyone in this room would believe that. In it, he had finally done what she'd been unable to do for herself all these years. He had told the truth. The letter was his confession, his acknowledgement of what he'd done to her and what he'd allowed to happen afterward. It was his apology for the lies that had shaped her life, his recognition of the future he'd stolen from her with his cowardice. It was also his request for her forgiveness, though she suspected that was more for his benefit than hers. Most importantly, it was permission, not that she needed it, but after so many years of doubt, of wondering if her memory was reliable, of questioning whether the pain had been real. Having validation in his own words felt like a gift from the universe. Charlotte stepped forward, her movement causing a subtle shift in the room's energy. Conversations died away completely now, all attention focusing on her with the sharp clarity of a spotlight. She could feel their surprise, their curiosity, their discomfort at this unexpected development. "I'd like to speak," she said, her voice carrying further than she'd expected in the suddenly silent room. The walk to the front of the room felt like crossing an ocean. Each step carried the weight of 23 years, each breath drew in the accumulated skepticism and judgment of her neighbors. Charlotte was acutely aware of her appearance, the careful simplicity of her clothing, chosen not to draw attention, the way she'd pulled her dark hair back severely, the absence of makeup that might suggest vanity or deception. She had learned to make herself small, invisible, unremarkable. Tonight, stepping into the light, she felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. The microphone seemed miles away, though it was perhaps only 20 feet from where she'd been standing. The room's silence was profound, the kind of quiet that occurs when collective breath is held, when an entire community pauses in anticipation of something significant. When she finally reached the small stage area, Charlotte turned to face the assembled crowd. The faces looking back at her were a cross-section of her life in Rochester Hills, former classmates now married with children, neighbors who had lived parallel lives separated by invisible walls, newcomers who knew her only through reputation and whispered stories. She could see Catherine Thompson near the back, her expression guarded but curious. David stood beside her, his arms crossed, his face skeptical. Their daughter Claire, now 16, watched with the frank interest of someone too young to fully understand the social complexities at play. The Schmidt family occupied several chairs in the middle section, Margaret's face a study in barely concealed discomfort. Her husband James kept checking his watch, as if hoping this unexpected interruption might somehow speed toward its conclusion. Near the front, Elena Rodriguez had positioned herself in a seat that offered a clear view of both Charlotte and the rest of the room. Her expression was encouraging, though Charlotte could see the concern in her eyes, the uncertainty about what was about to unfold. And scattered throughout the room were the faces of people who had been part of her life's narrative without her consent, the cashiers who had served her with cool politeness, the parents who had guided their children away from her path, the neighbors who had watched her from behind curtained windows and found her wanting. Charlotte pulled the letter from her coat pocket, its presence both anchor and sail. The paper rustled softly in the microphone, the sound amplified and strange in the expectant silence. "Most of you know who I am," she began, her voice steadier than she'd dared hope. "I'm Charlotte Murphy. I live on Maple Street in the blue house with the overgrown garden. I shop at the Kroger on Main Street, usually on Tuesday mornings when it's less crowded. I work at the library in Troy, shelving books and helping people find what they're looking for." She paused, scanning the faces before her. Some were familiar from decades of careful distance, others belonged to people she recognized but had never actually spoken to. What most of you don't know is who I really am. For 23 years, I've lived with a story that wasn't mine, a reputation built on lies I was too scared and too young to correct. Tonight, that changes. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the kind of collective intake of breath that precedes either revelation or disaster. Charlotte could see the skepticism in several faces, the protective closing off that occurs when people prepare to defend their existing beliefs against unwelcome challenges. 23 years ago, when I was 19 years old, I was in an abusive relationship with someone many of you knew and respected. When I finally ended up in the hospital with a broken wrist and facial injuries, I told the police I'd fallen down the stairs. It was a lie, but it seemed like the right thing to do at the time. I thought I was protecting someone I loved, someone whose future seemed more important than my present pain. The murmur grew louder, more agitated. Charlotte could see heads turning, people exchanging glances loaded with meaning. She pressed forward, knowing that if she stopped now, she might never find the courage to continue. That lie became the foundation for everything that followed. When I tried to end the relationship 2 months later, my abuser began spreading stories about my mental health, my supposed instability, my tendency towards self-harm and manipulation. By the time I realized what was happening, the narrative had taken on a life of its own. "This is ridiculous," a voice called out from the middle of the room. Charlotte turned toward the sound and saw James Schmidt on his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "We all know what really happened. Daniel Kelly is a respected attorney now, has been for 20 years. Are you seriously going to stand there and accuse him of—" "I'm not accusing him of anything," Charlotte interrupted, her voice cutting through his objection with surprising strength. "I'm letting him accuse himself." She held up the letter, its pale surface catching the overhead lights. "This arrived in my mailbox this morning. It's from Daniel Kelly, and in it, he admits to everything I've just told you and more." The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, disbelief, outrage, confusion mixing into a sonic storm that seemed to shake the very walls. Charlotte waited, the letter clutched in her hand like a shield against the chaos. "He writes about the night he broke my wrist," she continued when the noise finally died down, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who has nothing left to lose. "He describes the pattern of psychological abuse that preceded and followed that incident. He acknowledges the lies he spread about my mental health, the way he systematically destroyed my relationships and my reputation to protect himself." "Let me see that letter," James Schmidt demanded, striding toward the front of the room. "This is nothing but a desperate attempt to finally clear her name." Elena Rodriguez stood up, her voice calm but firm. "James, I think we should let Charlotte finish." "Why now?" The question came from Margaret Schmidt, her voice strained with emotion. "If this is true, and I'm not saying it is, but if it's true, why wait 23 years to tell us?" Charlotte looked at Margaret, seeing in her face the same mixture of confusion and protective disbelief she'd encountered so many times over the years. How do you explain the psychology of abuse to someone who's never experienced it? How do you make them understand the way trauma can steal your voice, can make you complicit in your own erasure? "Because I was 19 and scared and convinced that what happened to me mattered less than his future," Charlotte said. "Because every time I tried to correct the story, I was told I was lying, manipulating, seeking attention. Because after a while, you start to wonder if maybe everyone else is right. Maybe you're the problem. Maybe you really are as broken as they say you are." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, seeing the beginning of understanding in some, the stubborn resistance in others. "Daniel writes about the guilt that's eaten at him for 2 decades. He describes watching me become a pariah in the community we both grew up in, knowing he was responsible but too cowardly to speak up. He talks about the success he built on the foundation of my destroyed reputation, the career he forged helping other domestic violence victims while staying silent about his own crimes. This is a fabrication," James Schmidt insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Daniel Kelly would never." "Daniel Kelly is coming here tonight," Charlotte announced, the words falling into the room like stones into still water. "He's driving up from Birmingham to stand beside me and confirm everything in this letter. He should be here any minute." The silence that followed was absolute, The kind of quiet that occurs when the fundamental assumptions of reality are suddenly called into question. Charlotte could see the calculation in people's faces, the rapid mental gymnastics of trying to reconcile what they believed for 2 decades with the possibility that they'd been catastrophically wrong. Outside, the winter wind continued its assault on the building, rattling windows and doors with increasing intensity. Inside, the assembled crowd sat in stunned contemplation of a truth that would require them to reimagine not just Charlotte's story, but their own role in perpetuating her exile. The sound of a car door slamming in the parking lot reached them through the walls, followed by footsteps on the sidewalk approach. Charlotte felt her heart rate accelerate, her breathing becoming shallow. This was the moment she'd been building toward for 23 years, the collision between truth and deception that would either vindicate her or destroy what little remained of her life in Rochester Hills. The community center's front door opened, bringing with it a blast of cold air and the figure of a man who had haunted Charlotte's nightmares for more than 2 decades. Daniel Kelly stepped through the doorway like a ghost materializing from winter's depths, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every person in the room. The years had been kind to him in the way they often are to successful men. His hair had silvered at the temples in a distinguished fashion. His expensive overcoat spoke of prosperity. His bearing carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. But Charlotte could see what others might miss. The way his hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves, the pallor beneath his winter tan, the haunted quality in his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and moral reckonings too long delayed. This was not the triumphant entrance of a man confident in his righteousness. This was the arrival of someone who had finally exhausted his ability to carry a terrible burden alone. The room remained frozen in tableau, a community caught between the story they believed for 2 decades and the possibility that everything they thought they knew was built on lies. Charlotte watched as recognition dawned on face after face. He was immediately recognizable despite the years, the local boy who'd made good, the success story that had made Rochester Hills proud. Daniel's eyes found Charlotte's across the crowded room, and in that moment, she saw an apology that transcended words. It was the look of someone who had carried the weight of unforgivable actions for 23 years, who had built a life on the foundation of another person's destroyed reputation, and who had finally reached the point where the cost of silence exceeded the price of truth. He moved through the crowd with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield of his own creation. People instinctively made way for him, their expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror as the implications of his presence began to register. "I'm sorry I'm late," Daniel said as he reached the front of the room, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone that had served him well in courtrooms but now seemed fragile, uncertain. "The roads are getting worse, and He trailed off, looking at Charlotte with an expression that held 23 years of regret. "You came," Charlotte said simply, her voice barely audible through the microphone, but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I should have come 23 years ago," Daniel replied, his words falling into the hush like stones into deep water. "I should have stood up the morning after you were in the hospital. I should have told the truth when you tried to leave me. I should have stopped the lies before they destroyed your life." The admission hung in the air like a visible thing, transforming the atmosphere in the room from skeptical tension to something approaching shock. Charlotte could see the moment when belief shifted in people's faces, the widening of eyes, the unconscious leaning forward, the recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented. James Schmidt, who had been so vocal in his disbelief moments earlier, now sat in stunned silence, his face pale with the implications of what he was hearing. His wife Margaret had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with the kind of horror that comes from realizing you've been complicit in a grave injustice. "Tell them," Charlotte said, her voice gaining strength from Daniel's presence, from the validation of her truth finally standing before the community that had rejected it. "Tell them what you wrote in the letter. Daniel nodded, his throat working as he swallowed what might have been the last remnants of his protective cowardice. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the room, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood the weight of confession. "I was 21 years old when I first hit Charlotte," he began, the words causing several people in the audience to gasp audibly. "We'd been dating for 8 months, and I was drunk and angry about something that seemed important at the time, but that I can't even remember now." She said something that challenged me, and I backhanded her across the face. Charlotte felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with revisiting those memories, but also something new, a sense of vindication, of finally being heard after decades of enforced silence. "She forgave me," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger as he moved deeper into his confession. "She made excuses for me, told herself it was the alcohol, that it would never happen again. And I let her believe that because it was easier than facing what I'd become." Catherine Thompson, who had been standing near the back of the room, slowly sank into an empty chair, her face ashen. Her husband David placed a protective hand on their daughter's shoulder, as if shielding her from the ugly reality being unveiled before them. "But it did happen again," Daniel said. "And again. Not often enough to create a pattern anyone would notice from the outside, but frequently enough that Charlotte began to change. She became quieter, more careful around me, more eager to please. She started making herself smaller, and I told myself that meant she was happy, that we were happy." "My God," someone whispered from the middle of the room. Charlotte thought it might be Victoria Kelly, though she couldn't be sure through the rushing sound in her ears. "The night she ended up in the hospital, we'd been arguing about her plan to apply for a scholarship to Wayne State. I didn't want her to go, didn't want her to have opportunities that might take her away from me or give her ideas about independence. When she insisted she was going to apply anyway, Daniel paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I grabbed her wrist and twisted it until I heard it snap. When she fell, trying to get away from me, she hit her face on the coffee table. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of quiet that occurs when the fundamental order of things has been irrevocably altered. Charlotte could feel the shift in the room's energy, the way 23 years of assumptions were crumbling in real time. I drove her to the hospital," Daniel continued, his confession now unstoppable, like water breaking through a dam. "Sat in the waiting room pretending to be the concerned boyfriend while she lied to protect me. When she told the police she'd fallen down the stairs, I felt grateful instead of ashamed. I thought I dodged a bullet." Elena Rodriguez stood up slowly, her face a mask of controlled fury. "You let her lie for you," she said, her voice cutting through the room's stunned silence. "You let her sacrifice herself to protect you." "Worse than that," Daniel admitted, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's face. "When she tried to break up with me 2 months later, when she finally found the courage to say she couldn't live with what had happened, I panicked. I couldn't bear the thought of losing control over her, but I also couldn't bear the thought of her eventually telling someone the truth about what I'd done. So you destroyed her reputation instead," Elena said, the accusation hanging in the air like a physical blow. "I told my friends she was unstable, that she'd been hurting herself to get attention, that she'd even thrown herself down the stairs during one of her episodes. I painted myself as the long-suffering boyfriend trying to help a troubled girl, and when she tried to contradict my story." Daniel's voice broke completely, and he had to pause to compose himself. "When she tried to tell people what really happened, it just seemed to confirm what I'd already told them about her mental state. Her denials became evidence of her delusions. Her pain became proof of her instability. I created a perfect trap, and she was caught in it." Charlotte found herself crying, not the silent tears she'd grown accustomed to over the years, but great, heaving sobs that seemed to release decades of accumulated grief. She felt Elena's arm around her shoulders, felt the presence of people who were finally seeing her as she truly was rather than as the character she'd been forced to play. "I built my career on the foundation of her destroyed life," Daniel continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "I became a family law attorney, specialized in domestic violence cases. I helped other women find the courage to tell their stories while staying silent about my own crimes. The irony ate at me every single day, but I was too much of a coward to do anything about it." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, its surface worn from handling. Last week, my daughter came home from her freshman year at University of Michigan. She's taking a women's studies class, and she was telling me about a project on the long-term effects of domestic violence on survivors. She was so passionate, so committed to helping women find their voices and reclaim their stories. Daniel's voice cracked again, and Charlotte could see tears running down his cheeks. I realized I was looking at the person I could have been if I'd had the courage to do the right thing 23 years ago. Instead, I'd stolen that possibility from Charlotte and built my redemption on her continued suffering. The room remained silent, but Charlotte could sense the shift in the air, the way the community's perception of her was fundamentally altering with each word Daniel spoke. The woman they'd shunned for 2 decades was being revealed as the victim of an elaborate deception, while the man they'd respected and admired was confessing to being the architect of that cruelty. "That's when I wrote the letter," Daniel said, holding up the envelope. "I couldn't carry the weight of this secret anymore, couldn't continue benefiting from Charlotte's silence. She deserved to have her story told, her reputation restored. She deserved to be seen as the survivor she is rather than the villain I made her appear to be." He looked out at the assembled crowd, his expression a mixture of shame and desperate hope. "I know this doesn't undo the damage I've caused. I know there's no way to give Charlotte back the 23 years of isolation and judgment she's endured because of my cowardice. But I hope that if I finally told the truth, if I finally took responsibility for what I'd done, maybe she could start to reclaim her place in this community. Maybe we could start to reclaim our humanity," Elena Rodriguez said quietly, her words carrying clearly in the profound silence that had settled over the room. The weight of collective realization was almost tangible, the understanding that they had all played a role in perpetuating an injustice, that their community had failed one of its own in the most fundamental way possible. Charlotte could see it in their faces, the shame, the horror, the dawning comprehension of what they had done and failed to do for more than 2 decades. Outside, the winter storm continued its assault on the building, but inside, something had shifted irrevocably. The truth, so long buried beneath layers of lies and assumptions, had finally broken through to the surface, bringing with it the possibility of redemption, not just for Charlotte, but for an entire community that had lost its way in the darkness of deception. As the evening wore on, people began to leave in small groups, but not before approaching Charlotte with individual apologies, offers of support, and invitations to coffee, dinner, book clubs, and other activities from which she had been excluded for decades. Each interaction carried the weight of recognition. They were seeing her not as the broken woman they had imagined, but as the survivor she had always been. When the last of the crowd had departed, Charlotte found herself alone with Elena Rodriguez and Daniel Kelly. The 3 of them stood in the community center's main room, surrounded by the detritus of the evening's revelations, abandoned coffee cups, scattered programs, folding chairs pushed askew by the drama that had unfolded. "What will you do now?" Elena asked Daniel, her tone carefully neutral. "I'll face whatever consequences come," he replied. "I'll tell my wife, my children, my law partners. I'll accept whatever professional and personal repercussions follow from tonight's confession." Charlotte studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulative charm that had once drawn her in, but finding only exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. 23 years, she said quietly. 23 years of your success built on my silence." "I know," Daniel said. "I know, and I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it." "No," Charlotte agreed. "It doesn't." They stood in silence for several minutes, 3 people connected by a history that had shaped all their lives in profound and irreversible ways. Finally, Daniel gathered his coat and moved toward the door. "Charlotte," he said, pausing at the threshold, "I know you don't owe me anything, but I hope someday you might find a way to forgive me. Not for my sake, but for yours." After he left, Charlotte and Elena remained in the quiet community center, the weight of the evening settling around them like snow. "How do you feel?" Elena asked. Charlotte considered the question carefully. How did she feel? The answer was more complex than she had expected. There was relief, certainly, the profound relief of finally being heard and believed. There was also grief for the years that had been lost, the relationships that had been severed, The woman she might have become if her path hadn't been so drastically altered. But underneath it all, she felt something she hadn't experienced in over 2 decades: hope. The silence that followed Daniel's departure seemed to stretch toward infinity, a held breath that encompassed 23 years of misunderstanding, prejudice, and collective failure. Charlotte stood at the front of the room, no longer the pariah who had slipped in from the cold, but the center of a moral reckoning that demanded acknowledgement from every person present. The first person to move was Claire Thompson, Catherine's 16-year-old daughter. She stood up slowly, her young face marked by the kind of clarity that sometimes comes easier to those who haven't yet learned to rationalize injustice. Without saying a word, she walked to the front of the room and placed herself beside Charlotte, her presence a statement that cut through the adult world's complicated negotiations with conscience. "I'm sorry," Claire said, her voice clear and strong in the profound quiet. "I'm sorry we all believed lies about you. I'm sorry we made you invisible." The simple honesty of her apology seemed to break something loose in the room. Margaret Schmidt stood next, her face streaked with tears, her earlier skepticism transformed into something approaching anguish. "Charlotte, Margaret's voice failed her, and she had to start again. "My God, what we've done to you. What I've done to you." One by one, other voices joined the growing chorus of recognition and remorse. Victoria Kelly approached the front, her steps hesitant but determined. "I borrowed your notes senior year," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You helped me pass AP English, and I repaid you by turning away when you needed support. I'm so sorry." The dam had broken. 23 years of enforced silence were giving way to a flood of acknowledgement, apology, and recognition that swept through the room like a tide. Charlotte felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. The community that had shunned her was finally seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time in decades. But even as she felt the warmth of their recognition, Charlotte understood that this moment came with its own weight. The truth she had carried alone for so long was now shared among all of them, and with that sharing came responsibility. They would have to live with the knowledge of their complicity, just as she had lived with the knowledge of her victimization. James Schmidt, who had been so vocal in his disbelief earlier in the evening, now sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs. His wife went to him, placing a gentle hand on his back, and together they seemed to embody the community's struggle to reconcile their past actions with their present understanding. "What happens now?" The question came from William Bradley, the evening's master of ceremonies, who had watched the entire revelation unfold with the stunned expression of someone witnessing a fundamental shift in reality. It was, Charlotte realized, the essential question. The truth had been told, acknowledged, accepted. But truth alone couldn't undo 23 years of damage. It couldn't restore the relationships that had been severed, couldn't return the opportunities that had been lost, couldn't heal the wounds that had been inflicted by decades of isolation and judgment. "Now we live with what we know," Charlotte said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "Now we decide what kind of community we want to be going forward." Elena Rodriguez stepped forward, her face set with determination. "We start by making amends. Real amends, not just words." "The community center has been looking for a new program coordinator," William Bradley said suddenly, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Charlotte, if you're interested, I can't think of anyone more qualified to help us build bridges in this community." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown across 23 years of isolation. Charlotte felt the weight of possibility, the chance to transform her years of exile into something that might serve others who found themselves on the outside looking in. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted, her honesty cutting through any potential false sentimentality. "I'm not sure I know how to trust this community again, even with all your apologies." It was, she knew, the most honest thing she could say. Forgiveness wasn't a switch that could be flipped by good intentions and sincere apologies. Trust, once broken so completely, required time and consistent action to rebuild. Then we'll have to prove ourselves, Catherine Thompson said, speaking for the first time since the revelations began. We'll have to show you, day by day, that we're capable of being the community you deserved all along. The winter storm outside had begun to subside, the wind's fury giving way to a gentle snowfall that painted the community center's windows with crystalline patterns. Inside, the assembled crowd continued their collective grappling with revelation and responsibility. As the evening wore on, people began to leave in small groups, but not before approaching Charlotte with individual apologies, offers of support, and invitations to coffee, dinner, book clubs, and other activities from which she had been excluded for decades. Each interaction carried the weight of recognition. They were seeing her not as the broken woman they had imagined, but as the survivor she had always been. When the last of the crowd had departed, Charlotte found herself alone with Elena Rodriguez in the quiet community center, the weight of the evening settling around them like snow. "What will you do now?" Elena asked. Charlotte considered the question carefully. How did she feel? The answer was more complex than she had expected. There was relief, certainly the profound relief of finally being heard and believed. There was also grief for the years that had been lost, the relationships that had been severed, the woman she might have become if her path hadn't been so drastically altered. But underneath it all, she felt something she hadn't experienced in over 2 decades: hope. 6 months later, Charlotte stood in her garden on Maple Street, no longer overgrown but carefully tended, watching the spring flowers push through the dark earth toward the light. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. Sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the darkest soil, given enough time and the right conditions. The job at the community center had materialized gradually, naturally, as Rochester Hills began the slow work of rebuilding itself around a new understanding of justice and community. Charlotte had started as a volunteer, helping with programs for isolated residents, then gradually taken on more responsibility as she rediscovered her capacity for trust. The scholarship fund Daniel had established was now supporting 3 young women as they pursued their education while recovering from domestic violence. Charlotte served on the selection committee, her experience providing invaluable insight into what survivors needed most, not just financial support, but recognition of their strength and potential. Not everyone in Rochester Hills had embraced the new reality with equal grace. Some residents, uncomfortable with the moral complexity of the situation, had moved away or simply withdrawn from community involvement. But others had stepped forward, determined to build something better from the wreckage of their collective failure. James and Margaret Schmidt had become 2 of Charlotte's most stalwart supporters, their earlier skepticism transformed into fierce advocacy. Catherine and David Thompson included her in their family gatherings, their daughter Claire having appointed herself as Charlotte's unofficial protector and champion. The relationships weren't perfect. How could they be, given the weight of history they carried? But they were real, built on a foundation of acknowledged truth rather than comfortable lies. Charlotte had also reconnected with some old friends from high school who had moved away and never heard the rumors that had defined her reputation. Through social media and careful phone calls, she had begun to rebuild some of the connections that had been severed by Daniel's campaign of character assassination. Elena Rodriguez had become her closest friend, the relationship growing from mutual respect into genuine affection. Elena understood, in ways that others couldn't, what it meant to start over, to rebuild a life from scattered pieces. As for Daniel, he had indeed faced consequences for his confession. His wife Eleanor had filed for divorce, his law partners had asked him to leave the firm, and several of his former clients had initiated malpractice suits. But he had also begun working with a local domestic violence shelter, providing legal services pro bono, and speaking to groups about the psychology of abusers. Charlotte had seen him twice since New Year's Eve, once at a community meeting about the scholarship fund, and once by chance at the grocery store. Both encounters had been awkward but civil, marked by the strange intimacy that exists between people who have shared profound truth with each other. She had not forgiven him, not in any complete or final sense. But she had begun to understand that forgiveness was not a destination but a journey, and that her healing did not require his redemption. The evening light was beginning to fade as Charlotte finished her gardening, the spring air carrying the scent of new growth and possibility. Tomorrow, she would go to work at the community center, where she was developing a program for other people who had been marginalized or isolated. Next week, she would attend Claire Thompson's high school graduation, having been invited to celebrate with the family. These were small things, perhaps, but they represented a revolution in Charlotte's world. She was no longer invisible, no longer defined by lies, no longer carrying her burden alone. Standing in her garden as darkness settled over Rochester Hills, Charlotte felt the weight of her journey and the lightness of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose authenticity over convenience, truth over comfort. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years, she felt like she belonged exactly where she was. The winter wind that had carried her to that New Year's Eve revelation seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the gentle breeze of a spring evening full of promise. The woman who had slipped into the community center as an unwelcome ghost had emerged transformed, not into someone different, but into who she had always been beneath the weight of others' lies. The light that follows truth is not always gentle, Charlotte had learned. Sometimes it burns, revealing things that were better left in shadow, demanding accountability that disrupts comfortable arrangements. But it is also the only light worth following, the only illumination that can guide a person home to themselves. As she turned toward her house, no longer a place of exile, but a sanctuary she had chosen, Charlotte carried with her the hard-won knowledge that some journeys, no matter how painful, are worth taking. Some truths, no matter how costly, are worth telling. And some communities, given the chance to choose between comfort and justice, will surprise you with their capacity for grace. The truth had set her free, but freedom, she had discovered, was not the absence of consequences, it was the courage to live with them authentically. And that courage, once found, could light the way for others who were still lost in the darkness of deception.